The very day my billionaire grandfather passed away. My family showed their true colors. Everyone was fighting over his estate. My dad couldn't stop them. So he dragged my mom and joined the chaos. When I arrived at the estate, Grandpa Charles was still lying on the bed. They hadn't even bothered to change his clothes. Some relatives were tearing each other's hair out over a luxury high-rise deed. Others were rolling on the floor wrestling for his Rolls Royce keys. This bunch of usually sophisticated, upper-class snobs was now fighting like animals. At a Black Friday sale, my mom hugged a heavy metal safe and screamed at me. "Haley, what are you standing there for? Take the diamond ring off your grandfather's finger." I rubbed my hands together and knelt beside the bed, ready to slide the ring off. At the moment I crouched down, I saw Grandpa's pinky finger twitch. Rubbed my eyes, Grandpa Charles's hand was completely still. Again. My heart did a flip. I didn't dare touch the ring anymore. Instead, I gently squeezed his finger. It was freezing cold. It didn't feel like a living person's hand at all. Just to be safe, I stood up and yelled over the noise. "Everyone stop fighting. We need to get Grandpa to the hospital right now." The shouting temporarily died down. My Aunt Mary rolled her eyes at me. "Your grandfather was literally just discharged from the hospital. To die at home." "What hospital?" I hesitated. What if he's not actually dead?" My Uncle Mark snatched a piece of paper and threw it right in my face. He had terminal brain cancer. "Haley, he was going to kick the bucket sooner or later. Now that he's finally gone. Why are you trying to ruin things with your bad vibes?" I picked up the death certificate and stared at it. It looked completely authentic. Did I really just hallucinate? Was Grandpa actually dead? Mark's wife, Chloe, curled her lips in disgust. "EDD is dead, but the old man didn't even leave a proper will. If he had, would we even need to be here tearing each other apart? My son Leo is the only grandson who carries the Miller name. Who else is the fortune supposed to go to?" Mary instantly lost her temper. "My son is also a boy. Why shouldn't he inherit? If anyone is disqualified from the family trust, it's Haley." She shot a venomous glare in my direction. "Haley is going to marry some guy and change her last name anyway. She won't even be a Miller. Giving her a piece of jewelry or two is already more than generous." Mom went berserk. She lunged forward and shoved Mary. "Who the hell do you think you are, Mary? You married out and changed your name, too. Charles loved my daughter the most when he was alive. If anyone deserves the lion's share, it's Haley." Seeing them about to claw each other's eyes out again, I covered my ears in sheer frustration and looked back at Grandpa. This time I saw it clearly. His eyelid twitched. It absolutely wasn't an hallucination. Grandpa was alive. But why was he faking his death? My throat went dry. I swallowed hard and tugged at my mother's sleeve. "Mom, please stop fighting. I don't want any of the inheritance." "Okay, let them have it." The room fell dead silent. Mark and Chloe exchanged looks and muttered under their breath. "What an idiot. Does Haley even realize how much money Charles had? It's enough for 3 generations to burn through for a lifetime." Mary crossed her arms sneering. "Oh, cut the saint act. If you really don't want the money, why don't you sign a waiver right now? Who are you trying to put on a show for? The corpse?" Actually, I was putting on a show for the corpse. But honestly, I couldn't entirely blame my family for being so heartless. Grandpa had always been an incredibly eccentric man. He had built a multi-billion-dollar empire from scratch, dominating real estate, tech, and retail. Even the state governor had to treat him with utmost respect. By all accounts, with that kind of wealth, our family should have been living like royalty. But Grandpa was naturally paranoid and hyper-cautious. He always suspected everyone was trying to steal his money. When my dad got married and asked for help with a down payment on a house, Grandpa accused him of trying to carve up the family estate. He threw my dad out of the house after a massive screaming match. Mary didn't get into college and wanted to open a small boutique. Grandpa mocked her relentlessly, saying she would just lose all his money. When Mark wanted to study abroad, Grandpa blasted him for being a spoiled brat who only wanted to squander his hard-earned cash. So despite our patriarch being the richest man in the state, our 3 families lived on tight budgets, constantly pinching pennies. How could such a stingy, overly calculating man pass away without securing his fortune first? This fake death was a setup. He was testing us. My knees went weak and I threw myself by his bedside sobbing loudly. What is wrong with all of you? Grandpa just passed away and all you care about is dividing his money. Aren't you afraid of breaking his heart? Stop acting. If you're so noble, sign the waiver. Mary clapped her hands and Mr. Davis, Grandpa's senior state lawyer, walked into the room dressed in a sharp, expensive suit. Mr. Davis. Haley just said she wants to waive her inheritance rights. Mary yelled eagerly. Mr. Davis looked at me. Is this true, Miss Haley Miller? Before I could speak, my mom panicked and pinched my arm hard. She's talking nonsense, Mr. Davis. My girl is just devastated by grief. She didn't mean it. Mr. Davis nodded slowly. Actually, before Mr. Charles Miller passed, he did leave a will. And everyone in this room has a chance to inherit his entire estate. The moment those words left his mouth, the bickering stopped. Everyone locked their eyes on the lawyer. Mark couldn't hold back. Mr. Davis, stop. Stop beating around the bush. Tell us, did he leave everything to my son, Leo? Mr. Davis calmly pulled a stamped document from his leather briefcase. The will was incredibly short, with only a few lines printed on it. To my ungrateful descendants, if you can find my most precious possession within 3 days of my passing, you will inherit my entire estate. Everyone stared blankly for a few seconds. No one expected Grandpa's will to be so bizarre. Mary rolled her eyes. Even in death, he has to be a pain in the ass. How the hell are we supposed to know what his most precious possession is? Mr. Davis, can you at least give us a hint? He owns so many things. Where do we even start looking? The others chimed in. Yeah. Give us a clue. Mr. Davis tapped his foot lightly. His most precious possession is hidden right here. In this old family estate. There is only one of it. Whoever finds it first will be the sole heir to the entire Miller fortune. The old estate had 3 floors. But Grandpa lived quite minimally. Mary's eyes suddenly lit up. Bolted toward the master bedroom. I know what it is. It has to be that, though no one knew what she had realized. Everyone immediately stormed after her like a pack of wolves. We watched as Mary reached into a secret compartment inside the nightstand and pulled out a yellowed land deed. I clutched it to her chest like a lifeline, looking at us defensively. I found this first. My dad stared at it for a moment, his eyes widening. That's the original deed to this estate. How did you know it was there? Mary smirked, because Dad loved me the most, obviously. I saw him hide it there when I was a kid. Mr. Davis, is this deed the most precious thing? Mr. Davis simply offered a polite, enigmatic smile. He didn't say yes and he didn't say no. The truth will be revealed on the day of the funeral. Remember, each family can only submit one item. But let me make this clear. If no one finds the correct item within 3 days, the entire Miller fortune will be donated to charity. I guess Grandpa's net worth was easily over $8 billion. No one in their right mind would willingly let $8 billion slip through their fingers, especially when they were so close to it. Mary held the deed tighter, but a shadow of doubt crossed her face. This land deed had been passed down through generations to fund his early business ventures. Grandpa had once mortgaged it. The very first thing he did after making his first million was buy this land back and build this estate. It was where my dad, Mark, and Mary grew up. It was undeniably sentimental. Mark and Chloe were green with envy. Still, Mark sneered. Charles owned dozens of properties. Who knows if he even remembered this old paper? Come on, let's keep searching. My parents immediately joined the frantic treasure hunt. Seeing me standing frozen, my mom smacked my shoulder. What are you doing? Search. Even if we don't sleep for 3 days, we have to find it. I looked down at Grandpa, who was lying peacefully in his bed, playing dead. My mind raced. What on earth did Grandpa want us to find? I couldn't figure it out yet. So I could only follow my parents around to pretend I was searching. To find this possession, Mark hired a top-tier private investigator. Mary literally brought in a celebrity psychic. My parents were desperately debating who they should hire. Finally, my mom snapped her fingers and called her father, Andrew. Andrew and Charles used to be best friends back in the day. He might know what Charles valued most. But fearing her elderly father might get too emotional, my mom didn't tell him that Grandpa had passed. She just asked casually over the phone. Andrew chuckled on the line. What did Charles love most? Well, it had to be his late wife. Of course, she's been gone for over 30 years now. Why are you asking? Did your husband finally decide to kiss up to his old man? My mom quickly made up an excuse and hung up. My parents decided to focus on things related to my late grandmother. Eventually, they actually managed to find their original engagement ring, hidden deep inside Grandpa's pillowcase. Meanwhile, the other two families seemed to have found their own leads. But everyone kept their mouths shut, glaring at each other like enemies. 3 days later, the funeral was held at the local chapel. Grandpa's body was placed in a glass cooling casket. The funeral home staff had dressed him in a formal suit. My greedy relatives had spent the last 3 days hunting for treasure, not spending a single second mourning him. Of course, because of their neglect. Nobody realized that Grandpa had been sneaking out of his casket late at night to eat snacks and use the restroom. The funeral was grand. All the men wore tailored black suits. The same people who were screaming at each other yesterday were now crying as if their hearts were breaking. Mary wept loudly. Dad. How am I supposed to live without you? Guest held her shoulders, comforting her. He's in a better place now. Stay strong. As everyone sobbed. I stood there silently, not shedding a single tear. Once the tedious service concluded, the main event finally arrived. Holding the will, Mr. Davis stood before the gathered crowd of relatives and distinguished guests. Today, we lay Mr. Charles Miller to rest. As for his final wishes, whichever of his 3 children presents his most precious possession will inherit his entire estate. Mary was the first to step forward holding the yellow deed. My dad valued this land more than anything. Even though it's remote. He turned it into a premier resort. Someone once offered him $100 million for it and he flat out refused. This is undoubtedly his most cherished possession. Mary held the deed high, looking incredibly smug. It seemed her celebrity psychic had given her a massive dose of confidence. My mom whispered anxiously in my ear. I heard your aunt's psychic supposedly channeled your grandpa. And he confirmed it's the deed. What if it really is? I glanced toward the casket. Grandpa lay there perfectly still, looking incredibly dead. Mary had definitely been scammed. Grandpa wasn't even dead yet. So how could a psychic channel him? Sure enough, Mr. Davis examined the deed briefly, then shook his head. This is not his most precious possession. Mr. Davis didn't even blink. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, handed the brittle land deed back to my aunt, and calmly marked a clean red cross on the legal ledger resting upon the podium. Item number 1, the 1974 Valley View Estate Deed, Mr. Davis intoned, his voice cutting through the hushed chapel like a scalpel. Status, rejected. It holds substantial financial and nostalgic value, but it is not the most precious possession of Mr. Charles Miller. Aunt Mary's jaw dropped. The smug, triumphant flush drained from her cheeks in a split second, leaving her skin an ashen gray. What? That's impossible. Mr. Davis, you're making a mistake. Look at the watermark. Look at the original registration stamp. My father nearly broke his back buying this land back from the bank in the 80s. The psychic told me. Your father never believed in psychics, Mrs. Vance, Mr. Davis replied, his tone dripping with glacial courtesy. And the terms of the testament are absolute. Each family branch is permitted exactly one official submission. Your submission has been entered and declined. You have forfeited your right to present further claims. Forfeited? Mary shrieked, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the chapel. You can't just disqualify me. I'm his eldest daughter. I spent $25,000 hiring that medium. A ripple of stifled chuckles and appalled murmurs swept through the rows of funeral guests, business partners, city council members, high society acquaintances, all watching the Miller family tear themselves apart like hyenas over a carcass. Before Mary could lunge at the podium, Uncle Mark shoved his way forward, physically elbowing his sister out of the aisle. Step aside, Mary. You always were an idiot, Mark snarled, his face twisted in ruthless satisfaction. He smoothed the lapels of his $3,000 bespoke suit and shot a condescending glance toward the glass casket. You brought a piece of dirt. Charles Miller didn't care about dirt. He cared about power. Mark reached into the inner breast pocket of his coat and produced an ornate, velvet-lined steel case. With deliberate, theatrical precision, he popped the brass clasps and opened the lid toward Mr. Davis and the gathered crowd. Inside lay a heavy, tarnished brass corporate seal, the original founding stamp of Miller Enterprises, carved with the family crest and the date of incorporation, October 12, 1968. My private investigator tracked this down in the sub-basement vault of the downtown headquarters, Mark declared, his voice ringing with absolute arrogance. The very seal Dad used to sign his first multi-million-dollar international trade deal. The instrument that built our empire from the ground up. He kept it locked away in a triple combination titanium safe that even the board of directors didn't have the codes to. If that doesn't represent everything Charles Miller lived and breathed for, nothing does. Behind Mark, his wife Chloe wore a triumphant smirk, clutching their teenage son Leo by the shoulder as if already posing for the cover of a financial magazine. I glanced back toward the glass cooling casket on the elevated altar. From where I stood in the third row, the lighting caught the profile of Grandpa Charles. His hands were neatly folded over his chest, framed by the satin lining. For a fraction of a second, I could swear the corner of his lip gave a faint, microscopic twitch, a silent, imperceptible sneer of pure contempt. Mr. Davis leaned forward, inspected the brass seal for barely 2 seconds, and picked up his fountain pen. Scratch. Another bold red line slashed through Mark's name on the legal docket. Item number 2, the 1968 founding corporate seal, Mr. Davis stated flatly. Status, rejected. Your submission has been processed and disqualified. Mark froze. The triumphant sneer vanished from his face, replaced by a dark, dangerous rage. What the hell do you mean, rejected? Davis, are you out of your mind? That seal founded an $8 billion conglomerate. What else could an old workaholic like him possibly care about more than the company he spent 50 years building? Evidently, Mr. Miller, Davis said, closing the velvet box with a sharp snap and sliding it back across the podium, you did not know your father half as well as you believed. You crook. You're rigging this. Mark yelled, slamming his fist down on the dark mahogany wood. Who paid you off? Did you doctor the terms to steal the estate for your own legal firm? Security, Mr. Davis said calmly, not even raising his voice. 2 burly men in black security uniforms stepped forward from the back of the chapel, placing heavy hands on Uncle Mark's shoulders. Mark tried to shake them off, spitting curses under his breath, but they firmly guided him back to his pew, where Chloe was already trembling with fury, hissing recriminations in his ear. That left only one family branch standing. My mother grabbed my father's arm with a grip so tight her knuckles turned white. David, it's our turn, she hissed in an urgent whisper. Get up there. Right now before that lawyer tries to pull another fast one. Go. My dad swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. He was the middle child. Always timid, always terrified of Grandpa Charles's booming temper. He wiped the cold sweat from his palms onto his trousers and walked up the carpeted steps toward the altar, pulling a small, faded blue velvet jeweler's box from his pocket. The entire chapel fell dead silent. Mary leaned forward with venom in her eyes. Praying for him to fail, Mark glared like a caged animal. Dad placed the box on the podium and popped the lid open with a trembling thumb. Resting on the aged silk was a modest, vintage platinum ring set with a small, cloudy quarter-carat diamond. It was worn thin at the base, scratched by decades of quiet domestic labor. Mr. Davis, Dad said, his voice quivering slightly. My father loved the company, and he loved this estate. But he never truly recovered after my mother passed away 30 years ago. He kept this ring, her original engagement ring. The one he bought when he was an apprentice mechanic with $15 in his bank account, hidden inside his pillowcase until the day he died. It was the only thing from her he never parted with. A low murmur rippled through the older guests in the audience. Several long-time friends of the family nodded slowly. It sounded poetic, sentimental, and impeccably moral. My mom turned back to the crowd, chin held high, radiating the self-righteous glow of a woman who believed she had just won $8 billion by outsmarting everyone with basic family values. Mr. Davis looked at the ring. His expression softened slightly, not with approval, but with a profound, weary sadness. He picked up the red pen. Scratch. Item number 3, the late Eleanor Miller's engagement ring, Mr. Davis. Announced. Status, rejected. My mom gasped so violently she nearly choked. What? Why? That belonged to his wife. Are you telling me Charles Miller had no heart at all? That he didn't care about the woman who bore his children? Mr. Davis looked up, his gaze steady and unforgiving. Mrs. Miller, when Eleanor Miller was dying in the municipal hospice 31 years ago, your husband didn't visit her for the last 3 weeks of her life because he was busy fighting over the title deed to her car. Mr. Charles Miller retrieved this ring from a pawn shop 2 days after her funeral because your husband had pawned it to pay off his gambling debts. The word struck like a physical blow. Dad flinched, stepping back as if slapped across the face, his face turning an ugly, mottled shade of crimson. Mr. Charles Miller kept it, Davis continued, each word dropping like an iron weight, not as a treasure, but as a permanent reminder of why he could never trust his own children with a single cent. It was his greatest regret, Mrs. Miller. Not his most precious possession. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dad shrank into himself, clutching the small box, and practically scrambled back down the aisle in utter humiliation. Mom looked ready to explode, her face purple with indignation and greed, but the sheer weight of Davis's revelation kept her tongue tied. Mr. Davis checked his gold pocket watch, then looked up at the entire chapel. As stipulated in the legally binding testament of Mr. Charles Miller, all 3 primary heirs have presented their chosen items. All 3 items have failed the verification criteria. Therefore, pursuant to Clause 12B of the Estate Charter, the entirety of the Miller estate, valued at approximately $8.4 billion, shall be liquidated in full and transferred to the State Orphanage and Public Healthcare Trust at precisely 12 o'clock noon today. Davis glanced at the grandfather clock standing against the chapel wall. It was 11:15. You have 45 minutes before the transfer documents become irrevocable. Mr. Davis added, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Unless an eligible heir presents the authentic item before 12, the Miller bloodline will receive nothing. Not a penny. Pandemonium erupted. The chapel descended into a zoo. Uncle Mark overturned a row of wooden prayer benches, lunging toward Mr. Davis with fists raised, only to be tackled by the security guards. Aunt Mary began tearing her own hair, screaming that Davis had falsified the legal documents, demanding an immediate court injunction. My mom was violently shaking my dad by the collar, berating him for pawning the ring 30 years ago and ruining their chance at $8 billion. Nobody looked at the casket. Nobody shed a single tear for the dead. Amidst the screaming, the tearing of clothes, and the flashing cameras of the local press who had just caught wind of the spectacle outside, I stood frozen in the center aisle, watching the chaotic madness unfold. I turned my head and looked directly into the glass cooling casket. Grandpa Charles was still lying there, perfectly composed in his tailored black suit. But his chest was rising and falling in shallow, rhythmic breaths. Under the rim of the glass, his right eyelid was half open, staring straight at the rabid mob of his children tearing each other apart over his empty shell. His gaze shifted slightly. His eyes met mine. In that brief, razor-sharp second of mutual recognition, Charles Miller didn't look like a dying patriarch. He looked like an old, wounded wolf who had just watched his pack tear down the den for scraps of meat. His fingers twitched against the black satin. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, his left hand drifted down toward the inner lining of his suit pocket, tapping 3 distinct times against his hip. Tap. 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 The rhythm was unmistakable. When I was 9 years old, Grandpa had a tiny, dusty woodworking shed behind the old estate's carriage house. It was the only place on the 50-acre property where he didn't allow servants, lawyers, or business partners. Whenever I hid there to escape my parents' constant screaming matches about money, Grandpa would never kick me out. He would just sit at his scarred oak workbench, whistling an old folk tune, tapping his mallet against the vise 3 times, before tossing me a wooden block and a dull piece of sandpaper. Tap. 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 My heart thudded against my ribs like a trapped bird. Without saying a word to my parents, without looking back at Mark or Mary, I turned on my heel, slipped through the side door of the chapel, and ran out into the pouring autumn rain. The downpour was freezing, soaking through my black dress as I flagged down a Yellow cab on the street corner. Valley View Estate, I breathed, slamming the cab door shut. The old carriage. House. Please, hurry. The driver stepped on the gas. The wipers slapped rhythmically against the windshield, keeping time with the frantic thumping in my chest. My mind raced through the past 15 years. My family thought Charles Miller was a monster of greed. They thought he hoarded his billions out of pure spite, enjoying the sight of his children struggling on tight budgets. But they never understood why he had become that way. They only saw the multi-billion-dollar empire. They forgot that 40 years ago, before the real estate boom, Charles Miller was just a stubborn carpenter with calloused hands and sawdust in his hair, working 18 hours a day to feed a family that began demanding sports cars and designer clothes the moment his first patent took off. When had my dad last visited Grandpa without asking for a check? When had Aunt Mary called him on his birthday without attaching an invoice for her failed boutique? When had Uncle Mark ever sat down for dinner without bringing a legal contract for Charles to sign over his voting shares? Never. To them, Charles Miller wasn't a father. He was an ATM with a pulse. 20 minutes later, the cab screeched to a halt at the iron gates of the Miller estate. The main mansion was still a ransacked disaster zone, drawers pulled out, floorboards pried open by my greedy cousins during the 3-day search. I ignored the main house entirely. I sprinted through the overgrown grass, my heels sinking into the mud, toward the dilapidated carriage house at the far western corner of the grounds. The wooden double doors were secured with an old, rusted iron padlock, while the rest of the estate had been torn apart by private investigators and high-end metal detectors. This shed had been completely ignored. The dust on the padlock was undisturbed, the spiderwebs across the doorframe were intact. To my relatives, this place was an eyesore, a piece of worthless junk that Charles was too cheap to demolish. I reached up to the wooden beam above the doorframe, feeling blindly with my fingertips along the rough cedar plank until my nail caught on a small, hidden nail. Hanging from the nail was a tiny, rusted iron key. I shoved the key into the padlock, twisted it with all my strength. With a harsh, metallic screech, the lock snapped open. I threw the doors wide. The air inside smelled of old pine, linseed oil, and decades of settled dust. Sunlight filtered through the grimy clerestory windows, illuminating a room frozen in time. A long wooden workbench stretched across the back wall, covered in hand planes, chisels, and jars of oxidized nails. There were no safes here. No gold bars. No high-rise deeds. I walked slowly toward the workbench. Sitting right in the center of the oak surface, perfectly cleared of dust as if it had been placed there just days ago, was a small, unpolished box made of rough cedar planks. It was held together by crude wooden dowels, its edges slightly uneven, the unmistakable work of an amateur. Carved into the lid in shaky, childish handwriting were 4 simple words. For Dad's hard work. My breath caught in my throat. Tears, hot and sudden, welled up in my eyes. I remembered. 20 years ago, when I was 6 years old, my dad, Uncle Mark, and Aunt Mary had gotten into a massive screaming fight with Grandpa in the main dining room, demanding he buy them luxury apartments in the city center. They had called him a selfish old miser, slammed the door, and left him sitting alone at a banquet table full of cold food. I had found Grandpa sitting in this very shed that night, silently running his thumb over a splintered piece of pine. I didn't understand money back then. I only knew Grandpa was sad. So I took a few scraps of scrap wood from the floor, glued them together with wood glue, and gave him this clumsy, crooked little box so he would have somewhere to keep his pencils. I reached out with trembling hands and lifted the cedar lid. Inside the box lay a single, folded sheet of lined notebook paper, yellowed with age, and a plain, unengraved brass key. I unfolded the paper. Written across it in Charles Miller's sharp, commanding, yet unmistakably aged handwriting was a short note. Haley. A man spends his entire life building a mountain of gold, only to realize at the summit that gold cannot buy a single moment of genuine love. They searched for deeds, for stocks, for rings, for power. They looked for everything that bore a dollar sign, because to them, my worth was only ever measured by what they could take from me. You were the only one who ever gave me something without asking for a price tag. In return. If you are reading this, you understood what Charles Miller actually owned. Take it to the chapel. Finish the play. I clutched the note to my chest, grabbed the small wooden box, and ran out into the rain. 11:52 a.m. The chapel was on the verge of a full-scale riot. Mr. Davis stood behind the podium, his fountain pen uncapped, hovering over the final page of the irrevocable state trust agreement. 11:53, Davis announced, his voice reverberating through the microphone. In 7 minutes, the charitable transfer becomes permanent. The Miller family will retain no legal claim to any asset, subsidiary, or real estate holding previously owned by Charles Miller. Davis, you bastard. Uncle Mark screamed, held back by 3 security guards as he struggled violently. I'll spend every dime I have left suing you into oblivion. You won't get away with this. Sign nothing. Aunt Mary shrieked, collapsing dramatically onto the floor, clutching the hem of Davis's trousers. Give us another day. Just 24 hours. I'll find it, I swear I'll find it. My mother was sobbing hysterically against my father's chest, pounding her fists on his back. $8 billion, gone. Because of your stupid gambling. 30 years ago. We're ruined. We have nothing. The journalists in the back rows were furiously typing on their laptops, flashing camera bulbs illuminating the family's ultimate disgrace. Bam. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel were thrown open, slamming violently against the stone walls. The noise cut through the chaos like a gunshot. Every single head turned. I stood in the doorway, soaked to the skin, my hair plastered to my face, my shoes caked in wet mud. In my hands, cradled against my chest like the most fragile treasure on earth, was the crooked, unpolished cedar box. A collective hush fell over the room. My mother blinked through her tears, staring at me in utter disbelief. Haley? Where the hell have you been? What is that junk you're holding? Uncle Mark sneered, wiping the sweat from his forehead. Look at her. She brought a piece of firewood. Haley, have you lost your damn mind? We're losing $8 billion and you're playing arts and crafts. Aunt Mary let out a harsh, mocking laugh from the floor. Unbelievable. The girl is completely brainless. Davis is about to give the entire empire to an orphanage, and she brings a wooden toy. I didn't utter a single word to any of them. I walked down the long center aisle, my wet shoes leaving dark, muddy footprints on the immaculate red carpet. The guests parted from me in silence. The cameras turned their lenses toward the bizarre sight of a drenched girl carrying a child's wooden box. I climbed the carpeted steps of the altar, walked straight past my trembling father, and stopped directly in front of the podium. I set the rough cedar box down on the polished mahogany wood. Item number 4, I said, my voice clear, steady, and loud enough to echo in every corner of the sanctuary. Presented by Haley Miller. Mr. Davis looked down at the box. For the first time all morning, the lawyer's stoic, emotionless mask completely shattered. His eyes softened, his lips parted slightly, and a long, quiet breath escaped his chest. Uncle Mark lunged forward. Davis. Don't waste time on that garbage. Sign the injunction. Mr. Davis ignored him entirely. He reached out with both hands, gently lifting the cedar lid. He looked at the handwritten note inside, picked up the plain brass key, and closed the box with the utmost reverence. He picked up his fountain pen. He did not draw a red cross. Instead, in bold, sweeping black ink, Mr. Davis signed his name on the master deed of the Miller Family Trust, stamped it with the official state seal, and closed the legal docket. Verification complete, Mr. Davis announced, his voice ringing like a bronze bell across the chapel. Item number 4, the 2004 cedar keepsake box. Status confirmed. The chapel fell into a silence so absolute you could hear the rain tapping against the stained glass windows. Mark's mouth hung open. Confirmed? What do you mean confirmed? The terms of the testament have been fulfilled, Mr. Davis declared, looking squarely at the gathered family. The most precious possession of Mr. Charles Miller was never his land, his company, or his fortune. It was the only uncorrupted piece of affection he ever received from his family. By the power vested in me as executor, I hereby declare Miss Haley Miller to be the sole and exclusive heir to the entire Miller estate. No. Aunt Mary screamed, scrambling to her feet like a madwoman. That's a lie. That's a piece of trash she glued together when she was 6. That's not an asset. You can't give $8 billion to a 22-year-old girl over a piece of scrap wood. She cheated. Chloe shrieked, shoving her son Leo forward. Leo is the only male heir. This is illegal. We demand a forensic audit. We'll contest this in the Supreme Court. Shut up. All of you, shut your damn mouths. Uncle Mark roared, his face purple, charging up the steps toward me. Give me that box. Give it to me right now, Haley, or I swear to God I'll. You'll do what, Mark? A voice spoke. It wasn't Mr. Davis. It wasn't my father. It was a deep, raspy, gravelly baritone that carried the terrifying, unmistakable weight of 50 years of absolute authority. The entire room froze as if struck by lightning. Uncle Mark stopped dead in his tracks, his foot hovering over the top step, his eyes bulging in pure, primal horror. Behind the podium, inside the glass cooling casket, the heavy tempered glass lid smoothly began to slide back on its motorized brass hinges with a low, mechanical hum. A pale, thin hand, veins prominent beneath paper-thin skin, reached up and gripped the edge of the mahogany coffin. Then, slowly, deliberately, the corpse of Charles Miller sat straight up. The scream that tore out of Aunt Mary's throat was loud enough to shatter glass. She stumbled backward, tripped over her own black dress, and crashed hard into the first row of wooden pews, kicking frantically like a terrified child. Uncle Mark went as white as a bedsheet. His knees completely buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the carpeted stairs, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Gigi ghost. Chloe whimpered, grabbing Leo and burying her face in her son's chest, trembling uncontrollably. My dad clutched his chest, gasping for air, while my mom let out a strangled squeak and fainted dead away onto the floor. The distinguished guests, the city officials, the board of directors, all 50 people in the congregation scrambled backward in sheer terror, knocking over chairs and programs, pressing themselves against the back walls of the chapel. Charles Miller swung his long legs over the side of the casket. He was wearing his bespoke black burial suit. He smoothed the wrinkles from his trousers, reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a small silver comb, and calmly combed back his gray hair. He stood up. He didn't stumble. He didn't look like a man with terminal brain cancer. He looked like an emperor who had just returned from a long hunting trip to inspect his kennels. Close your mouth, Mark, Grandpa Charles said coldly, stepping down from the altar platform with slow, measured strides. You look like an idiot. Dad. Mark stammered, hyperventilating on the floor, dragging himself backward on his hands. You were dead, the certificate, the hospital. A certified death certificate signed by the chief of medicine at St. Jude's. Grandpa replied, stopping at the podium and resting his hands casually on the wood. A private room, a confidential medical NDA, and a $2 million donation to their oncology wing to keep the staff quiet for 3 days. He turned his piercing, eagle-like gaze toward Aunt Mary, who was sobbing in terror under a pew. Brain cancer? Charles sneered, his voice dripping with disgust. I had a minor case of acid reflux and an inflamed gallstone, Mary. But the moment I coughed at dinner last month, you and your brother started calling estate liquidators. Before the soup was even cold. Grandpa turned slowly, looking down at each of his children, his eyes devoid of any warmth. 3 days, Grandpa said quietly, but every word sliced through the chapel like a razor. I lay in that bed for 3 days. You tore the wallpaper off my walls. You kicked down my doors. You fought over my car keys while I was still lying in my clothes. He walked over to Uncle Mark, standing over his trembling son. You brought a private investigator into my house, Mark. You looked for my corporate seal so you could stage a hostile board takeover. He turned toward Mary. You spent $25,000 on a charlatan psychic to channel my spirit, while your father was starving in the other room because you didn't even bother to check if my body was cold. He looked at my father, who was cowering beside my unconscious mother. And you, David, you brought your mother's ring. The very ring you stole from her jewelry box while she was coughing up blood in the hospital 30 years ago, just so you could bet on a horse race. Dad buried his face in his hands, weeping in silent, crushing shame. Not one of you, Charles said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register, shed a single genuine tear. Not one of you asked Mr. Davis how to arrange a proper burial. Not one of you came to my bedside to hold my hand and say, goodbye, Dad. Grandpa walked back to the podium and gently picked up the crooked cedar box. His thumb traced the shaky carving on the lid, for Dad's hard work. Only Haley, Grandpa said softly, his voice finally cracking with a sliver of genuine emotion. She was the only one who noticed my eyelid twitch. She was the only one who begged you to stop fighting and take me to the hospital. And when you pushed her aside, she didn't look for gold. She looked for my heart. Grandpa looked down at Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis. Yes, Mr. Miller. Are the irrevocable trust documents finalized? Signed, sealed, and officially registered with the state probate office as of 12 o'clock, sir, Davis replied with a crisp nod. Miss Haley Miller is now the sole legal owner and primary trustee of the Miller Family Trust, encompassing all 84 subsidiary corporations, real estate portfolios, and liquid holdings. Good, Grandpa Charles said. He turned back to the room. As for the rest of you, Grandpa Charles announced, his gaze sweeping over Mark, Mary, and my parents with absolute finality, you wanted a piece of my estate. You shall have it. He raised one finger. From this day forward, every single allowance, company credit card, luxury vehicle lease, and trust fund stipend attached to Mark Miller, Mary Vance, and David Miller is permanently terminated. No. Dad, please. Mary screamed, crawling toward his feet, clutching his pant leg. We have mortgages. We have private school tuition for the kids. We'll be bankrupt in a month. Grandpa Charles looked down at her and coldly pulled his leg away from her grasp. Then I suggest you get a job, Mary, Grandpa said without a shred of pity. I hear the local supermarket is hiring cashiers at $15 an hour. Perhaps 3 generations of hard labor will finally teach this family what a dollar is actually worth. He didn't look at them again. Grandpa Charles turned to me. The terrifying, iron patriarch melted away, replaced by the tired, gray-haired old man who used to teach me how to sand down cedar planks in the back of the carriage house. He extended his arm toward me. Come along, Haley, Grandpa Charles said with a warm, faint smile. I've been lying in that refrigerator for 3 days, and the ham sandwiches Davis brought me at midnight were terrible. Let's go home and have some real lunch. I looked at my sobbing parents, at my disgraced aunt and uncle, and finally at the crooked little wooden box resting safely in Grandpa's hands. I took his arm. Together, we walked down the center aisle of the chapel, stepping through the rain and into the bright, clearing autumn light, leaving the howling wolves behind us in the dark.